Jesus didn't come to establish a religion.
He came for me.
For you?
In response, we follow him unconditionally.
We take risks.
Bet the farm.
Push our chips to the middle of the table.
Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes.
We go all in. We go all in. All in.
All in.
All in.
All in.
We go all in.
All in.
Well, I want to welcome everyone who is watching online. Man, it is exciting. We say this all the time. We are one church, many locations, and you are living it out once again today. You know, last week, Pastor Carter gave us a message that encouraged us to choose our faith over our fears. And I want to say, if you didn't go out and watch that message, I just want to challenge you this week to go out and watch it. It was a great message. And it was great to have Pastor Carter back. Well, 2 weeks ago, Pastor Elliott kicked off our All In series, and he talked about the life of Noah and how Noah went all in. He said yes to God. But what happens in your life when you can't muster up the courage that it takes to go all in? I mean, when you have fear that's blocking you from doing that thing that you should do or that you want to do. You know, when I was a kid, I loved riding motorcycles. I enjoyed it, wanted to do it all the time. My family had a bike down at our family farm. And I want to tell you, I loved going there in the summer, particularly during harvest, because I got to ride all week long. I would go into the barn in the morning, roll out my bike, and I would take off, and you wouldn't see me for hours. One day, my dad was talking to my grandpa, Owen, and he was talking about looking for something in the barn. And I don't remember exactly what he was looking for, but I do remember this. He said, as I was there looking in the barn, I turned, and as soon as I turned, there was this big black snake hanging down from the rafters. Well, I loved riding motorcycles, but I hated snakes. And I want to tell you, that stupid snake, and I began to develop some fear, and that fear won over my love for riding bikes. Man, I just was totally paralyzed by it. Isn't it funny how fears and insecurities play out in our life? You know, we all have them. Yours just look a little bit different than mine. And I'm going to just go out on a limb and maybe just suggest that anxiety and maybe fear is creeping in a little bit as we look at this COVID-19 crisis. You know, there are so many things that we're making decisions about that we never dreamed we'd make decisions about. There's been so much that's been taken away from us, and it's happened so quickly. I never dreamed that we would actually have a day that we wouldn't be able to come into the church, that in our worship services, no one would be here, but it would all be online. You know, it seems like life has come to a grounding stop. It's almost like someone hit the pause button, this gigantic pause button in the sky, and everything is frozen. And you know what? That's what fear will do to you. Fear freezes you. And when we think about fear, and we talk about our reaction to it, a lot of times we think of two categories. We think we either fight fear or we're really in this flight mode. You know, we're really confronting fear or we're running away from it. But it leaves out one important response. You know, not just fight or flight, but psychologists would say there's this important third response that's very common. It's the freeze response. You know, when people in their life get overwhelmed, when anxiety spikes, and they just feel like they can't go on, what they actually do is they kind of get frozen. And they come to this point really where they can't go on. They just lock up experience paralysis. It's kind of like the response of prey who choose to play dead in front of the predator. You know, they just can't go on anymore. And I want to tell you, when fear freezes you in life, it can have disastrous results. If fear is powerful, it's primitive, you know, it alerts us to danger in life. It's really a common part of our makeup. And we all experience fear, but it is highly individual. Let me show you what I mean. I want everyone to play along with me. If you're there watching with your family, you're watching with your friends, or maybe you're just solo, you're there online, I want to mention a fear, and then if it's a fear that you have, I want you just to raise your hand, or if you're watching on service, just type it in. That's me, that's my fear. And if you're watching with someone that you know well, maybe in your family, if they're not being honest, I want you to call them out. I want you just to point your finger at them and say, that's you, baby. You need to admit that you're afraid of that. So let's start off. Here's the first one. Is anybody afraid of heights? Who's afraid of heights? If you're afraid of heights, raise your hand. How about this one? Anyone afraid of closed spaces? I mean, when you get in a tight space, do you start feeling claustrophobic? Now, what about the fear of flying? Do any of you out there have the fear of flying? What about the fear of spiders? Anybody afraid of spiders or mice? You know, this one may get some of you, especially our little ones. How many of you are afraid of the dark? If you're afraid of the dark, raise your hand. Mom and Dad, if you're not being honest, point the finger. Let them know, that's you, honey. You know, there are many of us that are also afraid of things that may not make sense, but we're just afraid of them, like a dog. I know many people are afraid of dogs. I had a friend that had a bad experience, and he still today is afraid of dogs. Or maybe you're afraid of storms. You know, you see something brewing on the horizon, and you start heading to the basement. You're like, you know, that's not anything that I want to be a part of. You know, the truth is, we all have fears. That there's all kinds of things that we're afraid of. And for our parents, I think this is one that is common as well. Have you ever seen a kid that is fearful of being separated from their parent? And they face separation anxiety. And I'm telling you what, the fear of a 2-year-old really is impressive. I mean, I've seen grown men almost get choked out when they're trying to get their kid off their shoulders and into the classroom. They're hanging on for dear life. You know, and another fear that many kids have is this, the fear of riding their bike. Now, I saw a dad this week who was taking advantage of the stay-at-home order, and he was out in the yard teaching one of his kids to ride their bike. And it took me back. I began to think about a time where I also tried to get one of my kids to learn to ride their bike. It was my middle daughter, Emma. You know, and I remember going to the store and showing her the bikes, and I let her pick out the bike that she liked. She got the helmet. I mean, we had all the gear. We had talked about this for weeks. I was excited for her, but I knew she was a little afraid. As we began one day to go out to get ready on the bike, she just couldn't hardly go. I mean, she struggled. She struggled being willing to go and get on the bike, but I eventually persuaded her, I coaxed her, and she got on the bike, and then this is what set in. Here's one of my favorite pictures. I mean, she is so fearful. You can see this look of anguish, and her sweet sister encouraging her. You know, eventually she got on. We were able to get her going, and at some point kick off the training wheels. And she kept riding that bike until one day she hit a tree, and then it was all over again. And she didn't want to ride anymore because she was afraid. You know, so why? Why do we push people when they're afraid? I mean, why as family or friends do we push someone when they're fearful? Why do we put up with the tears, the yelling, that look of anguish that you just saw? You know why. It's because we want them to overcome their fear. We know what's on the other side of their fear, and we want it so badly for them. We want them to experience this thing, whether it be riding a bike or whatever it would be. We want them to be able to experience that thing that we love. You know, it's one thing as a parent or a friend to try to push someone through their fear, to try to help them overcome. But can you imagine it from God's perspective? I mean, God understands what we have to gain once we push through, conquer our fear. He actually knows what's in store for us, and He desires for us to experience the other side of our fear. Well, here's the good news. We're not the only ones who have battled fear. In fact, the Bible is like a highlight reel of people who have been able to conquer, to overcome their fear. You know, there's so many names in the Bible, person after person, that really took on courage. They were willing to conquer their fear. And we would have known even some of their names if they wouldn't have pushed through and been willing to conquer that fear with courage. You know, there's one story that I want to share today. It's the story of Esther. It's found in the Old Testament. And you may have never studied Esther's story, but I want to catch you up on it. When we encounter the story of Esther, what we find, first of all, is that the Jews have just been conquered by the Persian Empire, and they've been exiled to the land of Persia. Some of them have been allowed, just a few of them, to go back to the nation of Israel, but they're still exiled there as well, under the rule of the Persian Empire. And we learn early in the story that there is this king, that's the king of Persia, Xerxes. And Xerxes has a queen named Vashti. And he decides that Vashti has lived really her expectancy as a queen as long as he's just allowed her to. He's tired of her. He wants her off the throne. I don't know if she burned his oatmeal, didn't allow him to watch his favorite Netflix episode. I don't know what it was, but he decides, I'm through with you. And so what he does is he comes up with this idea. I'm going to have a beauty pageant. I'm going to have a beauty pageant and get the best girls from all over the kingdoms to come in. And I will determine which one should be my wife. Real classy guy, right? So there he is, choosing these women, his servants going through the land to find the best of the best. And Esther is chosen. Esther's chosen to enter this pageant. And as she comes to enter the pageant, one of the things that she finds is a tip from her uncle. Her uncle Mordecai says this, Esther, I think it's great that you've been chosen to be a part of this pageant. I don't want you to share your nationality. I don't think it would be wise. I think you need to keep it a secret. So Esther agrees. Esther goes to the pageant. She rocks it out. She wins. Can you imagine? This is a storybook ending. We got a Jewish girl who is now the queen of Persia. I mean, you couldn't write anything better. Once a queen, always a queen, right? Well, that's not the end of the story. You see, Xerxes was a busy man. And because he was busy, he didn't spend as much time with his new queen. Yeah, they spent a lot of time at the beginning, but over time it began to wear off. He was more interested in conquering the world. And so he chose a man to be his second in command, Haman. Haman was going to help run his busy life, to help him continue to take more and more territory. And the problem with Haman was this. He was a peacock. Haman loved himself. And every time he went out of the palace, he expected everyone to bow down to him. He wanted everyone to pay him honor. He wanted to know that he was so important. But there was one man who wouldn't bow down. Do you think you know who it is? If you know, I'd encourage you right now just to shout it out. If you're following me online, just type it in. If you said Mordecai, you're right. Mordecai wouldn't bow down to Haman. And it infuriated Haman. And so Haman goes to Xerxes and he begins to develop this scheme. And he says to Xerxes, I want you to know, king, that there are some individuals living in the land who don't follow your rules. They're not interested in your rules. They follow the rules and laws of another God. They don't think they need to listen to you. And quite frankly, I think it's hurting your PR. I think we should deal with them. And here's the deal. I know you're super busy, so why don't you just leave it on me? I'll develop a plan if you'll just give me the authority to take care of these people. And so Xerxes goes, okay, I'll give you full rights to execute whatever plan you think is necessary. And so Haman goes plotting this ethnic cleansing of the Jews in the land of Persia. He gets all of his officials together and he begins thinking about how they can do this, and he develops this plan. And Mordecai catches wind of it. And Mordecai goes to Esther and says, Queen, I want you to know that Haman is developing a plan that not only threatens the Jewish race, but it threatens you and I too. He wants to rid the land of all of us. And Esther, of course, is brokenhearted by this news. But the problem is this. She hasn't been in Xerxes' presence in quite a while. Once again, Xerxes is a busy man. And there's another wrinkle in this as well. And it's this. There was a law in the land of Persia that anytime someone entered the king's presence without being summoned, that they could be put to death on the spot. And there was no exception for the queen. And Esther knew this. She knew that if she were to go speak to the king, even on behalf of her people, that she could die. And she begins to feel that fear entering her life. She begins to get frozen. She begins to struggle to find her voice. And Mordecai wants her to understand just how serious this is. That this is her time to have courage, to rise up, to be strong. And I want you to look at what he says here in chapter 4. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. I want you to think about those words. For such a time as this. For such a time as this, Mordecai is saying, Esther, you have a position. You have a voice. And I want to encourage you to use it. And I think this. I think that all of us believe that if we had to come through in the clutch, we would. We believe that if all the chips were down and we were needed, man, we'd be the person that could go ahead and break through our fear. And we could have courage. But I want to tell you something. Courage isn't something you just grab, but courage is something that you grow. This is important for us to consider as we think about this story today. And courage isn't just something you reach back and pull off the shelf to be able to put in play during the major crisis of your life, but it's something that's more systematic. Courage is something that we use every day. We fight back the fears, big and little, day by day, and that's what builds our reserve of courage. It's not just about having it when we want it. The devil wants to get a foothold. He wants us to be afraid, to fear, and God wants us to have courage, but it's done little by little. Those deposits we make all the time when we have fear in our life. And it's believing things. It's believing things that are true about God, His promises and His word. Do you remember what Joshua 1:9 says? This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. For I, the Lord your God, will go with you wherever you go. And God is saying to us, I want you to know that you have the ability to have courage and to not fear because I am with you. But you know what? When you're dealing with something like COVID-19, when the future is so uncertain, when there's so many things spinning in your mind, it's hard. It's hard to have courage. It's hard to know who to trust. Today there's so many things that we're called to trust in. We're called to trust in the CDC because they'll help us understand how to combat and get through this virus. We're called to trust in the Dow because it's going to continue to one day move back up where it needs to be. We're called to trust in President Trump and what his plans are to help us navigate through this. And I believe this, we're even called, many of us, by our own default to believe in ourselves, that I can make it through this, that I know what's best to do. But I want to ask you, Pathway Church, are you trusting in God? Is He your source of courage, even in the midst of a time that is uncertain and can be fearful? Well, I want you to look with me at Esther's response. She has a response after eventually finding her voice, having the courage that she needs to have. Her reply to Mordecai is this: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do, and when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law." And she says these famous words, "And if I perish, I perish." You know, Esther finds great courage. She finds great courage even in the midst of something that is overwhelming. And I want to tell you, when we talk about being all in, that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about having courage and a willingness to do what seems impossible. And Esther in this moment is willing to give up her status. She's willing to give up her convenience and even her life to save a nation, her nation. I want to tell you, this past couple weeks I've been thinking about people who had great courage. I thought about a friend of mine, Darlene Henderson, who attends the Westlink campus. And 17 years ago, there was a dark cloud in Darlene's life. There was a chaos that really occurred. And it wasn't in the form of a virus, but Darlene lost her husband. Her husband, Mike, to pancreatic cancer. And Mike and Darlene and their family were very special to the Hutch family because they were one of the first people that invited us into their home when we came back to Wichita. We formed a really powerful bond. You know, and I want to tell you, when Mike passed away, I wanted so bad to be there for Darlene, just as her pastor, as her friend, to encourage her, to help her in any way I could. And here you have this young mother who has 2 kids in college. She has one in high school at this point and an 8th grader. She has blinding grief. And so I began to pray, Lord, what can I do? And I remember one day feeling this nudge. Why don't you go talk to her about joining the high school ministry? Have her be one of your volunteers in the ministry. And so I went to Darlene, and I began thinking, this is a brilliant idea. I mean, why didn't I come up with this sooner? And I talked with Darlene about it, and the more I talked about it, I didn't think it was brilliant anymore. I thought it was bad. And Darlene convinced me it was bad. She said, Todd, you know me. You know I'm an introvert. You know that I'm not magnetic. I'm not one of these people that's going to walk around and high school kids are just going to want to come get to know me. And what about this, Todd? What if a kid comes and shows me some problem or wants me to help them navigate through a situation that I have no experience or wisdom for? And I remember leaving and just saying, Darlene, would you be willing to pray? I got in my car and I thought, man, that was a terrible ask. It was bad timing. I should have waited. And I thought, you know what? Darlene will surely say no. But Pathway Church, you know what she did? She said yes. And I want to tell you, Darlene, for the next 14 years, didn't just influence a few kids in our ministry. She didn't just influence a few dozen kids in our ministry. She influenced hundreds of kids in our ministry because she was willing to say yes. Because Darlene was willing to go all in. And one of those kids we met about a month ago. Her name is Caitlin Black. Caitlin grew up in Darlene's small group. And Caitlin, who is one of our global missionary partners in Mongolia, said Darlene's influence and really the time that she spent in high school being around Darlene was a huge part of her continuing to say yes to God in her life. And I just reached out to Caitlin. I said, Caitlin, would you just tell me what Darlene meant to you? And this is what she wrote. I'm so thankful for Darlene's well-timed entrance into my life in high school. Darlene was one of the first adults to communicate and show me the gospel. Her gentle spirit has always encouraged me and made me feel welcome in the highs and lows of life. Her example and presence through the years is one I'm continually inspired to emulate. Man, I'm so grateful. I am so grateful that Darlene said yes. That even in the midst of a time in her life where everything inside her was full of fear and the uncertainty of life, she was willing to go all in. And I can tell you, her influence and impact didn't just affect Caitlin's life, but so many other lives. We have an opportunity, Pathway Church, in the midst of this COVID-19 crisis, to really be willing to be used by God, to be all in. And whether it be outside the walls of our church or inside the walls of our church, God is wanting to use us. He's wanting us to break free of any fear that has frozen us so we can experience the courage that only comes from a God who is capable. So I just want to encourage you, Pathway Church. Be willing to say yes to the Lord today. Be willing to be used. Let's move together. Let's be all in. God's kingdom is so important. There's so much we can do. You know, as I was writing this message, I thought about a quote from one of our spiritual forefathers. And he just said this: if not you, then who? If not now, then when? I just want to challenge you this week to keep thinking about that. If not you, then who? If not when, if not now, then when? I just want to encourage you to write that down. Put it out on Facebook. Put it somewhere where you can focus on it and you can think about it, because God wants to use you. I want to pray that together we will have the courage, the strength to go all in, to be able to be a part of God's great plan today in the midst of this crisis and into the future. So pray with me. Father, I just pray that you would keep doing your good work in all of us who are listening. Lord, I just pray that you would allow us to, first of all, admit our fears. And Lord, there's a lot of fears. There's a lot of things to be concerned about in life. There's a lot of things that, Lord, actually can bring even paralysis to our life. And they feel overwhelming. And I just pray, God, that as we admit those to you, we would recognize today that courage only comes from you ultimately. That it's not something we can muster up in life. It's not something that we can just grab from the shelf. But God, we have courage because you have made promises about who you are that change us, that give us a new perspective, that give us trust and hope for the future. And so, God, would you allow us as a church here at Pathway to say yes this week? Would you allow us to be all in our neighborhoods and in our workplaces? And Lord, just with people that we'll come in contact with, that we'd be willing to be used by you. Don't let us hunker down now and take care of ourselves, but let us think of others. God, thank you. Thank you that there are so many people here at Pathway Church who have already said yes. They are already all in. Now, Lord, help us follow them. And I pray your church would be brilliant and beautiful in these days. As we continue praying, I also just want to ask you this question. As you're listening there online, who do you trust in? Or what do you trust in? I mean, when you really think about it, who is it that your ultimate level of trust is built in? Or what is it that you've built your trust in? As you think about those things, I just want to ask, how's it going? I mean, in a time like this, it seems like so many of the things that we've trusted in have begun to show their cracks. They've weakened. They're falling. And if that's you, and you recognize that, I want to tell you there's one you can trust in who is so powerful, who is capable of giving you everything that you need, making you secure, giving you a purpose and a future. And that's Jesus. Jesus is the one who can give you all that, but you have to surrender your life, to be willing to push your chips all in and to accept His plan, His rescue plan for your life and His desire to lead you. If that's you, as you're listening, I'd love for you just to pray this prayer, just in the stillness of your heart. Let me lead you. Father, I thank you so much. I thank you for allowing me to recognize that, Lord, my trust is built in many things that really haven't served me well. They've failed me. And even today, they look vulnerable or they don't look like the right thing. And so, Jesus, I just want to come and I want to trust in you. I recognize that only you can give me the courage to truly live life. And so, Father, please forgive me. Forgive me for trying to do it on my own. Forgive me for trusting in other things. And today I come and I trust completely and wholly in you. Jesus, thank you. Thank you for giving me life. Now let me figure out what it means to live in a way that is constantly saying yes, so that I can be a part of what you're doing here. It's in your name that I pray, Jesus. Amen.